The moment everything shattered. Night had already swallowed the mansion. The room was dim except for the golden bedside lamp casting long shadows across the silk sheets. Marco Santini lay back against the headboard, still recovering from a bullet wound to his shoulder. A reminder from last week's ambush that even kings bleed. His presence was powerful even in silence, even in pain. His wife, Isabella, sat beside him on the edge of the bed. Her movements were gentle, almost too gentle. In her hands was a delicate porcelain cup, steam curling slowly into the air like a whisper trying to escape. "My love," she said softly, her voice like velvet. "You need this to regain your strength." Marco watched her closely. Her smile was perfect. Her eyes were warm, but something felt wrong. Something about that smile felt rehearsed. Just as the rim of the cup touched his lips, the door burst open. A young woman stood frozen at the entrance, breathless, pale. Her uniform was simple, black dress, white apron, the uniform of a maid. Her name was Elena. She had worked in this house for 11 months, and in all that time she had never once raised her voice. Until now. Her hands trembled, but her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Don't drink it." Silence. Isabella's face drained of color. The cup slipped slightly in her grip. Marco lowered it slowly. His eyes, which had been tired just seconds ago, were now sharp. Dangerous. Elena stepped forward, fighting the fear that screamed at her to run. She had seen Isabella in the kitchen moments earlier, standing alone by the counter, crushing something into the drink. Powder. Not medicine. Not sugar. Poison. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Marco turned his gaze toward his wife, the woman he had trusted with his secrets, his empire, his heart. She couldn't meet his eyes. And in that single, suffocating moment, he understood. The betrayal wasn't from an enemy outside his walls. It was lying beside him in his own bed. That cup didn't just hold poison. It ended his marriage. The man who trusted no one. To understand what that moment meant, you must first understand who Marco Santini was. He was not born into power. He was forged by it. At 7 years old, Marco watched his father die on the cold floor of their one-room apartment in Naples. A debt unpaid, a bullet to the chest. His mother followed 3 years later, not by violence but by grief. She simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped breathing. By the time Marco was 12, he had learned the only truth the streets would teach him. In this world, you are either the hunter or the hunted. He chose to hunt. By 20, he was running collections for the Ferraro family. By 25, he had built his own crew. By 30, the Ferraro family no longer existed, and Marco Santini sat at the head of an empire that stretched across 3 countries. He was feared, respected, untouchable, but he was also alone. The men who surrounded him were loyal because they feared him. The women who approached him wanted his money, his power, his name. No one saw the boy who still woke up some nights, reaching for a mother who was no longer there. Marco learned to wear his loneliness like armor. He didn't need love. He didn't need trust. Until Isabella. She had been different, or so he thought. He met her at a charity gala in Milan, an event he attended only to clean his public image. She was a photographer, capturing portraits of the guests. She wasn't impressed by his wealth. She didn't flinch when she learned who he was. "Power doesn't scare me," she had said that night, her eyes steady. "Cruelty does." He fell in love with those words. They married within a year. Isabella became his partner, his confidant, the only person he allowed into the locked chambers of his heart. For 5 years, he believed she loved him. For 5 years, he was wrong. The girl who had nothing to lose. Elena Mancini was 23 years old. She had grown up in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps. A forgotten corner of southern Italy where the roofs leaked and the dreams were small. Her father had been a fisherman. A good man. Kind man. He died when Elena was 16, drowned in a storm that came without warning. Her mother never recovered. The grief settled into her bones like poison, and within 2 years, she was diagnosed with a disease that slowly stole her strength. Medicine was expensive. Doctors were expensive. Hope was expensive. Elena took every job she could find. Cleaning homes, washing clothes, serving food at weddings where she watched other girls her age dance and laugh, their lives untouched by sorrow. She didn't complain. She didn't envy. She simply worked. 11 months ago, she had answered an advertisement for domestic work at a private estate. The pay was more than she had ever earned. Enough to cover her mother's treatments. Enough to keep her alive. She didn't know whose house it was. Not at first. When she learned the truth, that her employer was Marco Santini, the most feared man in the region, she thought about leaving. Her hands shook during her first week. She avoided eye contact. She stayed silent. But she stayed. Because her mother needed medicine. Because there was no other way. And slowly something changed. She watched Marco from a distance. She saw him throw a man out of his office for striking a waitress. She saw him sit alone in the garden at 3 a.m., staring at the moon like he was searching for something he'd lost. She saw him hand an envelope of cash to the elderly gardener whose wife was dying, with no one else around to witness it. Elena began to realize that monsters were rarely born. They were made, and sometimes, buried beneath all that darkness, there was still something human trying to survive. The weight of one decision. The night she burst through that door, Elena had been walking down the hallway toward the kitchen to fetch water for her dry throat. That's when she saw Isabella. The lady of the house was standing alone by the counter, her back to the door, crushing something between her fingers. Elena paused at the edge of the doorway, hidden in shadow. She watched as Isabella stirred the powder into a cup of warm tea, her movements careful, precise. Then Isabella whispered something under her breath. Words Elena couldn't quite hear, and laughed softly. Cold, hollow laugh. Elena felt her blood turn to ice. She didn't know what the powder was, but she knew it wasn't medicine. She knew it wasn't meant to heal. In that moment, Elena had a choice. She could stay silent, keep her job, keep her income, keep her mother alive. Or she could speak. If she was wrong, she would be humiliated, fired, thrown out onto the streets. If she was right, and if she stayed silent, a man would die. Elena thought about her father. The day he left for the sea, he had kissed her forehead and said, "Always do what is right, even when it costs you everything. That is the only way to live without shame." She had never forgotten those words. And so, with terror flooding her veins, she ran. She ran down the hallway, up the stairs, past the guards who shouted after her, and she threw open the door to Marco's bedroom. And she screamed the only words that mattered. "Don't drink it!" The truth that burned. In the hours that followed, the mansion became a tomb. Marco's men took the cup to be tested. The results came within the hour. Arsenic. Enough to kill a man twice his size. Isabella was taken to a room downstairs. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. Marco sat alone in his study, staring at the wall where a portrait of their wedding day hung. 5 years. 5 years of believing he had found something real, something pure. He had been a fool. When he finally went to see her, Isabella was sitting calmly in a chair, her wrists bound, her expression empty. "Why?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not angry, just broken. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. That same cold, hollow laugh Elena had heard in the kitchen. "You really don't know?" Isabella said. "You thought I loved you? You thought anyone could love a man like you?" The words hit him like bullets. "You're a monster, Marco. Killer. A disease. I did what I had to do to survive in your world. And when the Conti family offered me a way out, money, freedom, a new life, I took it. The Conti family. His rivals. The ones who had sent the gunman last week. It all made sense now. The bullet wound. The ambush. Isabella had fed them information. She had been working against him for months, maybe years. And when the ambush failed, she decided to finish the job herself. Marco said nothing. He simply stood, turned his back to her, and walked out of the room. He didn't order her execution. He didn't raise his hand. He simply had her escorted from the estate with nothing but the clothes on her back. "If I ever see you again," he said without looking at her, "I won't be so merciful." And then she was gone. The woman he had loved. The lie he had believed. The girl who stayed. In the days that followed, Elena expected to be dismissed. She had caused chaos. She had humiliated the lady of the house. She had seen things no servant should ever see. But the summons never came. Instead, one evening, she was called to Marco's study. She entered with her head bowed, her heart pounding. The room was dark, lit only by a single lamp on the desk. Marco sat behind it, his face half in shadow. "Sit," he said. She sat. For a long moment he simply looked at her. His eyes were tired, heavy with something she couldn't name. "You could have stayed silent," he said finally. "You could have kept your job, your safety, your income. No one would have blamed you." Elena swallowed. "I couldn't, sir." "Why?" She thought about the question. She thought about her father, about the sea, about the life she had lived. Small and hard and full of loss. "Because," she said quietly, "I have lost too many people to stay silent when I could save one." Marco stared at her. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever looked at him like that. Not with fear, not with greed, but with something that almost resembled understanding. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena. Elena Mancini." "Elena." He repeated it slowly, as if tasting the word. "You saved my life. What do you want in return? Money? A house? I can give you anything." Elena shook her head. "I don't want anything, sir. I only want to keep working. I need the income for my mother. She's sick." Marco was silent. Then, for the first time in what felt like years, he did something he had forgotten how to do. He smiled. It wasn't a wide smile. It wasn't warm. But it was real. "You will keep working," he said, "and your mother will receive the best doctors in the country. That is not a reward. It is simply what should happen." Elena opened her mouth to protest, but Marco raised a hand. "You risked everything for a stranger. The least I can do is care for the only person you love." Elena felt tears burn her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." She stood to leave, but at the door, she paused. "Sir." "Yes." She turned to look at him. This powerful, broken man sitting alone in his dark room, surrounded by shadows. "You're not what they say you are," she said softly. "Not entirely." And then she left. Marco sat in silence for a long time after that. He didn't know why her words stayed with him, but they did. The slow unraveling. Months passed. Elena's mother received treatment from the finest specialists in Rome. The disease didn't disappear, but it slowed. There was hope now. Real hope. Elena continued to work at the mansion, but things were different. Marco began to notice her in ways he hadn't before. Not with desire, at least not at first, but with curiosity. He watched her move through the house with quiet grace, always working, never complaining. He watched her sit in the garden during her breaks, reading worn paperback novels she had brought from home. He watched her laugh with the other staff, her face lighting up in a way that made the whole room feel warmer. And slowly, something in him began to shift. He started asking her questions. Small things at first about her mother, her village, her books. She answered honestly, without flattery, without fear. She treated him like a person, not a boss, not a monster, just a man. And for Marco, who had spent his entire life being feared, that was more valuable than gold. One night he found her in the library, crying. She didn't hear him enter. She was sitting on the floor between two bookshelves, her knees drawn to her chest, sobbing quietly into her hands. "Elena!" She looked up, startled, wiping her face quickly. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." "What happened?" He knelt beside her, his voice soft. She hesitated. Then the truth spilled out. Her mother had taken a turn for the worse. The doctors said she might not survive the month. Elena was going to lose the only person she had left. Marco didn't speak. He simply sat beside her on the cold floor and stayed. He didn't offer empty words. He didn't promise miracles. He just sat there, in silence, letting her cry. And when she finally stopped, exhausted and hollow, he said the only thing that mattered. "You are not alone." The fire that nearly took her. 3 weeks later, the Conti family made their move. They had discovered that Elena was the one who had foiled Isabella's plan. They wanted revenge, not just against Marco, but against the girl who had ruined everything. The attack came at night. 3 men broke into the mansion, moving through the shadows like ghosts. They had one target, Elena, but they underestimated Marco Santini. He heard the breach before his security did. He moved through the house with the precision of a man who had survived 100 battles. He found them in the East Wing, closing in on Elena's room. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. When it was over, 3 men lay unconscious on the marble floor, and Marco stood in the doorway of Elena's room, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles. She was standing by the window, trembling. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. It wasn't planned. It wasn't proper. But he couldn't stop himself. He held her tightly, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, and he made a silent vow. No one would ever touch her again. A new beginning. Elena's mother died on a Tuesday morning in September. She went peacefully, in her sleep, with Elena holding her hand. Marco attended the funeral. He stood in the back, saying nothing, but his presence was felt. Afterward, Elena returned to the mansion. She had nowhere else to go. That night, Marco found her sitting in the garden, staring at the stars. He sat beside her. "I don't know what to do now," she said quietly. I spent so long fighting to keep her alive. Now that she's gone, I don't know who I am without that fight. Marco was silent for a moment. Then he said, I have spent my entire life fighting. Fighting to survive. Fighting to win. Fighting to become someone no one could hurt. He turned to look at her. But you taught me something, Elena. You taught me that there's another kind of strength. The strength to be kind when the world gives you every reason to be cruel. The strength to save a stranger, even when it costs you everything. She looked at him, tears glistening in her eyes. I'm tired of fighting, he continued. I want to build something different, something better. He reached out and took her hand. I don't know if I can change, but I want to try, and I want to try with you beside me. Elena didn't answer with words. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. And in that silence, something new began. 2 years later, the mansion was quieter now. Marco had stepped back from much of his empire, handing control to men he trusted while he focused on legitimate businesses. It wasn't an overnight transformation. The past doesn't disappear so easily. But it was a start. Elena ran a small foundation that helped children from broken homes. She had turned her pain into purpose, and Marco had never been prouder. They married on a spring afternoon in the garden where they had sat so many nights, talking under the stars. It was a small ceremony, only a handful of guests, no grand displays of wealth. Just two people who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light. As the sun set, Elena looked at Marco and smiled. Do you remember the night we first met? She asked. He nodded. You screamed at me not to drink poison tea. She laughed. A real laugh, full of warmth. I was terrified, she admitted. So was I, he said quietly. But not of dying. I was terrified because, for the first time in years, someone cared whether I lived. He took her hand. You didn't save my life that night, Elena. You gave me a reason to live it. She squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. And you gave me a home, she whispered. They stood together in the fading light, two broken people who had somehow made each other whole. The past would never fully disappear. The scars would never fully heal. But for the first time in either of their lives, the future felt bright. And that was enough.